Welcome back, Wahlburgers. Today we are looking at the topic of, the overall American colonies. So far we've just been looking at them by bits and pieces. Here we're going to finally look at them all together. And we're covering a lot, so buckle up. Our big questions, or objectives, because I have two of them that aren't really questions, are these. Describe what the early relationship was like between the British government and the American colonies. Describe the differences between the northern and southern colonies. And then I want to know, how did the French and Indian War lead to tensions between the colonists and the British government? So when we talk about the relationship between England and its colonies, we have to go back to this idea of mercantilism. Fun word. But this is an economic system where nations seek large amounts of gold and silver and establishing trade practices that favor the country. Okay, that was a lot. I understand that. But think back to the game that we played just the other day, where we were all acting as different countries or colonies with gold and raw materials and food. Who ultimately benefited from that game? So, for example, the American colonies, they would provide lumber, tobacco, indigo, or other raw materials to England. Raw materials are just, materials that get made into other stuff. So they would get the basic stuff from the colonies that would then be sent to England. England would make better stuff out of it. And then they would send those manufactured goods back to the colonists and expect them to buy them. We actually have a local tie at Cornwall, the Cornwall Iron Furnace. They would be digging ore out of the ground, and that iron then would be sent back to England to make stuff out of. It's a very interesting system there. To add to that, in 1651, England passed what they called the Navigation Acts, which actually did a lot of different things, trying to control the trade in the American colonies. But one key thing was that it required all materials from the colonies to pass through an English port. So again, think about our game the other day, where if you were one of the colonies, you could not trade with any of the other colonies, or France or Spain, for example. You would have to send it to England first, and then England could send it elsewhere. And as a colonist, a lot of you were getting frustrated by that idea. And just like you did, the colonists got upset by that as well. So in certain circumstances, England was very hands-off when it came to the colonists. But here when we talk about trade, they were very, very focused on, making money off of the colonies. So let's look at the northern and the southern colonies. And I'm actually going to start in the south. These were basically based on plantations, which were very, very large farms devoted to a singular cash crop. Those crops may have been tobacco, rice. Indigo is a blue dye that was, made a lot of money. The society was focused on wealthy planters, these owners of these plantations. They kind of ran society. However, we do have to obviously mention then the slaves that worked for them. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So we do have a large slave population. As compared to the northern colonies, and here I'll start in the north, basically Pennsylvania and Delaware, and going up north more. New England, as some of us found out, not very well suited to farming, very rocky soil, long winters. The middle colonies were considered a breadbasket of sorts, so that they were able to grow crops. But what we see in these northern colonies more are larger centers for manufacturing, cities, as compared to the south. So major industries start popping up, that they're grinding wheat, they're fishing, they're cutting down lumber to make ships out of. You start seeing textiles or making fabric. And so cities start to form with trade. We see merchants, people who buy and sell things, kind of being the center of society. But I do want to point out, though, there were still slaves in the north, especially early on. So again, just to kind of give some context here, what's the north, what's the south? The blue and green colonies there I'm going to call that the South. All right, Maryland, all the way down south there. All the yellow and red states, colonies. They're colonies right now. They are going to be our northern colonies. Notice that Maine is part of Massachusetts, by the way, and Vermont's part of New York at that time. Just fun nerd stuff. So, we need to talk about slavery and definitely have this definition down, where slaves are just people who are considered property of others. And as property, they were supposed to be doing work for them. We saw it as field labor mostly in the South. And this is going to be a topic that, unfortunately, we need to talk about time and time again in our country's history. And slavery has actually been part of this continent's history as soon as colonizing happened. The Spanish were at least tried to enslave the Native Americans at the time. That wasn't too successful, mostly because they knew the land very well, and so they could run away and hide. But we also saw those slaves being killed by all the diseases that the Europeans brought over. And it's not until 1619 that we see the first batch of African slaves come over. In fact, that was just recently celebrated. Not celebrated, but remembered, because we're now hitting 400 years of our history where when slavery started really existing in what is now the United States. So African slaves started being brought in. And we also have to talk about this thing called triangular trade. There's a term you definitely should know as well. This is any trading process that has 3 legs, 3 parts. But for our purposes, we are going to refer to the trip between New England to Africa, to the West Indies, and back. So the reason I say triangular trade is any trade route with 3 legs is, you can see it here. There's all sorts of ways that trade is being moved around. However, what I want you to focus on are the blue arrows going from like New York to Philadelphia down to Africa. Here we see items being shipped to Africa: rum, iron, gunpowder, cloth tools. Then from Africa we have this pink arrow that goes to the Caribbean, the West Indies, so areas like Cuba and Haiti and the Dominican Republic, where we have slaves coming over. And then from there, we take the purple little arrow there, more slaves go up north, but we also get sugar and molasses. That sugar and molasses in New England get turned into rum, so now we have a manufactured good, and then the process starts all over again. That pink route right there, the journey from Africa to the Western Hemisphere, we often refer to as the Middle Passage, which is this voyage that took enslaved Africans to the Americas. And we'll dig into this topic a little bit more this week, but suffice it to say, it is not one of the shining examples of America's history. We do see that slavery is vital to the Southern colonies' growth. That's how they were able to grow so much stuff. But we do see slaves in the northern colonies as well. So, finally, let's talk about our first war. The French and Indian War. Takes place between 1754 and 1763. It is also known as the 7 Years' War, because historians apparently can't math. Also, it's been referred to as really the First World War, because we start seeing fighting not just in North America. We actually see it in Europe, and we see it in other places as well, because this is fighting between England and France. They've been rivals forever. There's not a whole lot of time that England and France weren't fighting, until really recently. Excuse me. But however, they both claim areas in North America, and so they fight here as well. And so we call it the French and Indian War, because the French were partnered up mostly with most Indian tribes. So it was the French and the Indians that they were fighting, versus the English. And at this point, the colonists are still considering themselves English, but they're kind of their own brand. So I refer to them as the colonists, and there's some Indian tribes as well that fight with the English, mostly to try to get at the other Indian tribes, potentially. We do have this young new officer by the name of George Washington. You may hear about him later. He's a young military officer trying to make a name for himself, and he holds a fort called Fort Necessity. Actually, he doesn't hold it. I apologize. You can actually go to a rebuilding of it outside of Pittsburgh. And yada, yada, yada. Fighting happens. We're not going to get into that a whole lot. But England ultimately wins. So here we have a nice map of what's going on. On the left, pre-war boundaries there. The purple areas is what England owns. Then we can recognize where the colonies are. The orange area is where the French own. And that the striped area, the orange and the purple, that's what they were really fighting over. This Ohio River Valley, this area that was west of the Appalachian Mountains. In the end, though, we see that England wins everything east of the Mississippi River. So you see that on the right side there. And this is kind of the impact of the war, and this is why it actually becomes important and why we do need to talk about it. So England gains all that land east of the Mississippi River. Woo-hoo-hoo. Colonists want to move there, right? However, we already have American Indians that live there, and they're not going to be too happy that all of a sudden people are moving into their land. The French kind of left them alone, so new people in charge aren't making these people happy. So in light of this, England passes the Proclamation of 1763 that's banning all settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now the colonists see this as, hey, we got all this land, why can't we go out there? And a lot of people actually ignore that. But we're starting to see people not be too happy with English rule. And the last point I definitely want to make here is war is really, really expensive. It doesn't matter if it was the French and Indian War or any war as of today. It's really expensive. And because of that, England goes into debt. And we start seeing that England needs to start making money and starts turning to the colonies to help pay off this debt. And this is a topic that we'll get into more next week. So thank you. I know this was a long video here. Again, review those questions for our quiz on Thursday, and then again for our review quizzes in the future. Thank you. Have a great day.